I will never forget the day my own son imprisoned me, the day my world turned upside down. I always believed that home was a place of love, safety, and trust. But he shattered that trust, and my life changed forever. My son, the boy I raised, cared for, and supported through every challenge, became the person who locked me away. The woman he loved more than his own mother had manipulated him, convincing him to betray me in the worst way possible. I tried, countless times, to make him understand the importance of love, respect, and family. I reminded him of the sacrifices I had made, the sleepless nights I endured for his well-being. But he refused to listen. He had grown so proud, so blind in his own selfishness, that he ignored everything I ever taught him. 2 long years passed, years filled with his cruelty, his poor decisions, and his reckless indifference. Every day, I held on to a single hope, that one day this nightmare would end and justice would be served. But I could never have imagined the depth of his betrayal or how far his greed and desire would go. Now, the day of my release is approaching, and I know, with every fiber of my being, that he will never forget what he has done. The moment I step out, his life will change forever. He will realize, too late, the cost of betraying his own mother. I have waited. I have grown stronger. And when that day comes, he will pay for every wrong he has done. The moment my son locked me away, my life changed in ways I could never have imagined. The first few days were unbearable, confusion, shock, disbelief, but over time, despair gave way to a quiet determination. I realized that if I were to survive, I could not rely on anyone else. I had to find strength within myself. The days turned into weeks, the weeks into months, and the months into years. 2 long years passed. During that time, I watched my son's life unfold from behind the walls he had built around me. I could hear the faint echoes of his conversations, the laughter that once brought me joy, now a reminder of the betrayal that had imprisoned me. I spent those years reflecting on everything, on my own mistakes, on the moments I had overlooked warning signs on the choices he had made. I remembered the times I had given him advice, tried to guide him, tried to warn him about the people who might take advantage of him. But he had refused to listen. He had allowed himself to be blinded by infatuation, convinced that the world owed him something he did not earn. And yet, amidst the despair, I discovered a resilience I never knew I had. I learned patience, endurance, and the quiet art of planning. I thought constantly about the day I would be free, about how I would reclaim my life, and about how I would make him understand the depth of his mistakes. I did not dwell on hatred. I focused on strength, strategy, and timing. During those 2 years, I observed him. I learned his patterns, his habits, the way he reacted to pressure, the little weaknesses he tried to hide. Every mistake he made, every careless word, every sign of arrogance, it all became part of my understanding. I was not the powerless victim he thought I was. I was patient. I was learning. I was preparing. The woman who had influenced him, the one who had encouraged him to betray his own mother, was a constant presence in my thoughts. I hated her for a time, yes, but mostly I learned to see her as a tool. He had foolishly allowed to manipulate him, and I knew that when the time came, both of them would feel the consequences of their actions. I spent countless nights imagining that day of reckoning. I imagined walking out the door, free at last, and confronting him, not with anger alone, but with a quiet power he could not anticipate. I imagined the shock in his eyes when he realized that I had not been broken, that I had not been defeated, and that everything he had taken from me would be returned piece by piece. Yet, I also reflected on the love I still carried for him. It was impossible to deny that he was my son, and despite the betrayal, a part of me longed for the man I had raised him to be, the one who could have loved, respected, and cherished his family. But that hope was tempered by reality. The choices he had made, the cruelty he had displayed, and the trust he had shattered were not things that could be erased with apologies. And so, as the years crawled by, I transformed despair into focus. I let every moment of suffering sharpen my mind, strengthen my resolve, and fuel a plan that would ensure that justice would be served. I realized that revenge was not about rage. It was about patience, strategy, and timing. It was about ensuring that when the day came, he could not escape the consequences. Now, as I feel the first hints of freedom approaching, I know that those 2 years of endurance have changed me. I am no longer the woman who feared her own child. I am a mother who has survived betrayal, who has grown stronger in adversity, and who will no longer allow herself to be wronged. He thinks he has won. He thinks I'm powerless. But the moment I step out of these walls, he will understand the true cost of his actions, and he will regret it more than he can imagine. He had foolishly allowed to manipulate him, and I knew that when the time came, both of them would feel the consequences of their actions. I spent countless nights imagining that day of reckoning. I imagined walking out the door, free at last, and confronting him, not with anger alone, but with a quiet power he could not anticipate. I imagined the shock in his eyes when he realized that I had not been broken, that I had not been defeated, and that everything he had taken from me would be returned piece by piece. Yet, I also reflected on the love I still carried for him. It was impossible to deny that he was my son, and despite the betrayal, a part of me longed for the man I had raised him to be, the one who could have loved, respected, and cherished his family. But that hope was tempered by reality. The choices he had made, the cruelty he had displayed, and the trust he had shattered were not things that could be erased with apologies. And so, as the years crawled by, I transformed despair into focus. I let every moment of suffering sharpen my mind, strengthen my resolve, and fuel a plan that would ensure that justice would be served. I realized that revenge was not about rage. It was about patience, strategy, and timing. It was about ensuring that when the day came, he could not escape the consequences. Now, as I feel the first hints of freedom approaching, I know that those 2 years of endurance have changed me. I am no longer the woman who feared her own child. I am a mother who has survived betrayal, who has grown stronger in adversity, and who will no longer allow herself to be wronged. He thinks he has won. He thinks I'm powerless. But the moment I step out of these walls, he will understand the true cost of his actions, and he will regret it more than he can imagine. After 2 long years of isolation, fear, and silent endurance, the day I had dreamed about was finally within reach. Freedom. The simple word carried so much weight. It was not just about walking out of the house that had become my prison. It was about reclaiming my life, my dignity, and the power that had been stolen from me. Every moment of my captivity had prepared me for this. Every sleepless night, every pang of loneliness, every moment I endured his betrayal, it had all sharpened my mind and hardened my resolve. I was no longer the helpless woman he thought he could control. I was a mother transformed, patient, calculating, and ready. I thought constantly about him, my son. I reflected on the choices he had made, the way he had allowed a stranger to manipulate him, the countless ways he had tried to erase me from his life. And yet I did not hate him blindly. I understood that beneath his arrogance and selfishness, he was still the boy I had raised. But understanding him did not mean forgiving him. Not yet. Forgiveness would come only when he had paid the price for his betrayal. As the days of my impending release drew nearer, I began to formulate my plan, not out of spite alone, but to ensure that he would comprehend the depth of what he had done. He had imprisoned me physically, but he had also trapped himself in ignorance, arrogance, and carelessness. I would use those flaws to my advantage. I began visualizing the moment I would step outside for the first time in years. I imagined a shock in his eyes when he realized that I had not been broken, that I had endured everything and emerged stronger, smarter, and ready. He would see that his actions had consequences far beyond what he could imagine. Every detail mattered. I thought about timing, about the small interactions that could reveal his guilt, about the subtle ways I could expose the truth of his betrayal. This was not about immediate confrontation. It was about ensuring that every step he had taken against me would unravel, leaving him to face the results of his choices. And then there was the woman, the one who had whispered poison into his mind. She had believed she could manipulate, control, and even destroy me. But she had underestimated me. She had underestimated the power of a mother's love, patience, and strategic mind. She would soon discover that her influence had limits, and that the person she had underestimated most was the very woman she thought she could destroy. But the thought that fueled me most was not revenge for revenge's sake. It was justice. It was the restoration of balance in a world where betrayal and selfishness had temporarily triumphed. I would reclaim my life, my home, and my dignity, and I would make sure he would never forget the consequences of his actions. I have waited patiently. I have planned carefully, and soon he will learn the hardest lesson of his life, that a mother's strength cannot be imprisoned or broken. The day had finally arrived. I could feel it in every fiber of my being. Freedom was no longer a distant dream. It was a tangible reality waiting just beyond the doors that had confined me for 2 long years. My heart raced, but not with fear. It raced with anticipation, with focus, with a quiet determination that only those who have suffered betrayal can understand. I stepped into the world I had been denied for so long, and everything felt different. The air seemed sharper, the light brighter, the world both familiar and alien at the same time. And in that moment, one thought consumed me. He would soon understand the true cost of what he had done. For 2 years, he had believed I was powerless. He had believed that he could erase me from his life, manipulate me, and continue his reckless ways without consequence. But he was wrong. Every plan, every observation, every patient hour of endurance had prepared me for this exact moment. I did not rush. I moved carefully, deliberately. Each step was calculated. I watched, I listened, and I waited for the perfect opportunity to reveal just a fraction of the knowledge I had gathered during my captivity. This was not about immediate revenge. It was about precision, about making him realize that every action has consequences. I began with subtle reminders, small things only he would notice. A message left where he couldn't miss it. A quiet, pointed action that hinted at my awareness of his schemes. He reacted immediately, though he did not know why. Anxiety flickered in his eyes. I saw the first cracks in his arrogance, the realization that perhaps I had not been as powerless as he believed. And then came a next stage, strategic exposure. I allowed him to see glimpses of the truth. The lies he had spun to manipulate others began to unravel. Friends who had been swayed by his stories began to question him. The woman who had thought she could control him started to sense the shift in power. And all the while, I remained calm, composed, and in control. But it was more than just a tactical game. There was a personal element that fueled me. The betrayal had cut deep, and now, the first taste of empowerment brought a surge of clarity. I realized that revenge is not just about punishing someone for what they did. It's about reclaiming your own life, your voice, your dignity. And I would do it carefully, methodically, until the full weight of his mistakes hit him. Every day, he began to feel the tension. Every interaction, every small slip, reminded him, sometimes subtly, sometimes sharply, that I was no longer a victim. I was a force he had underestimated. And with each passing hour, the anticipation grew, both for me and unknowingly for him. He thought he could control me. He thought I would break. But he is about to learn that a mother's patience is as dangerous as her love is deep. And when he finally realizes it, it will be too late. Cliffhanger ending. I was no longer trapped in his lies, in his manipulation, or in the prison of fear. The first strike had been made, and the ripple effects were beginning to show. But the battle was far from over. He would soon discover that freedom is only the beginning, and revenge is only the opening act. The taste of freedom was intoxicating, but I knew that true liberation was not merely stepping outside. It was reclaiming my life and ensuring that my son understood the consequences of his actions. For too long, he had believed he could erase me from his life, manipulate reality, and act without accountability. But now, the tables had turned. I began to act with careful precision. Every word, every gesture, every interaction was calculated. I allowed him glimpses of my awareness, small reminders that his arrogance had blinded him to the truth. Friends, neighbors, and even those he trusted began to notice subtle changes in behavior. Minor inconsistencies, the unraveling of the web of lies he had spun so recklessly. He tried to maintain control, but I could see the cracks forming. Anxiety flickered in his eyes at the smallest things. He could not understand how I had survived, how I had remained calm, and how I had turned his betrayal into strength. He was no longer the master of the situation. He was the one under scrutiny. I also turned the attention to the woman who had manipulated him, the one who had convinced him that imprisoning his own mother was acceptable. She began to realize that she had misjudged me, underestimated the quiet resolve that only a mother could possess. Every lie she had helped him believe started to unravel. She was no longer in control, and I relished the slow but inevitable exposure of her influence. The days became a battlefield of subtle, psychological warfare. I would leave things in plain sight that hinted at my knowledge, things only he would understand. Every careless move he made, every arrogant glance, every slip of the tongue, it all became a weapon in my hands. And with every passing hour, I could see the fear growing, the unease settling into his mind. He began to second-guess himself, question his choices, and wonder how much I truly knew. But this was only the beginning. The reckoning was not about instantaneous punishment. It was about a long, deliberate unveiling. Every piece of his life that he had assumed was secure was now vulnerable. His pride, his reputation, his carefully constructed illusions, all were in jeopardy. And the woman who had manipulated him would also feel the consequences of underestimating me. Through it all, I remained composed. I did not let anger guide me, for anger can be fleeting and blinding. Instead, I let strategy guide my every action, patience shape my responses, and clarity of purpose determine my timing. I was no longer a victim. I was a force, patient, calculating, and unstoppable. He believed he could destroy me. He believed I would break. But he is learning, slowly, painfully, that I have only grown stronger. And the truth, when it fully reveals itself, will strike harder than anything he has ever faced. Every step I took, every subtle action I initiated, brought me closer to the ultimate revelation. The day was coming when he would see the full measure of his mistakes. The day was coming when his world would crumble, and he would understand the true meaning of betrayal, patience, and revenge. But that day was not today. It was still building, and I would ensure that when it arrived, the impact would be unforgettable. The moment I had been waiting for had finally arrived. Every sleepless night, every pang of betrayal, every careful plan and patient observation, all of it had led to this day. The day my son would fully understand the consequences of his actions. I did not rush. I walked with quiet confidence, each step measured, each breath controlled. I had become a force shaped by endurance, strategy, and unwavering determination. He believed he had defeated me, that my spirit had been broken. But he was about to learn how wrong he was. The subtle hints, the psychological pressures, the careful exposure of lies, all of it had prepared the ground. Friends who had once been deceived by him began to see the cracks in his story. The woman who had manipulated him realized too late that she had underestimated the very person she thought powerless. And, in the middle of it all, he began to crumble. I approached him, not with anger that would fade, but with the undeniable presence of a mother who had endured betrayal and emerged stronger. The look in his eyes when he finally realized that I had not been powerless, that I had not been defeated, was unforgettable. Fear, regret, and disbelief mingled in his expression. He understood, at last, the weight of what he had done. I reminded him of every choice, every betrayal, every cruel act. I showed him, carefully and deliberately, the consequences that had been quietly building over 2 years. His life, which he had assumed was secure, began to unravel. And with every revelation, his arrogance crumbled. You thought you could erase me, control me, and act without consequence. But all along, I was watching, learning, and preparing. And now, you see the truth. The woman who had convinced him to betray me faced her own reckoning. The web of manipulation she had spun was exposed, and her influence over him weakened. The man I had once called my son realized, painfully, that he had allowed himself to be guided by deception, and that his betrayal had consequences far beyond what he imagined. Yet, I did not act out of vengeance alone. I acted to reclaim my life, my dignity, and the power that had been stolen from me. Each revelation, each moment of discomfort he faced was a lesson in accountability, a lesson he would not forget. By the end of the day, the transformation was complete. He had faced the reality of his actions. He had experienced fear, regret, and the undeniable truth that betrayal carries a cost. And I, standing tall, free at last, knew that justice had been served, not through anger, but through patience, endurance, and strategy. I have survived. I have reclaimed my life. And you, who betrayed your own mother, will never forget the lessons of these past years. This is not just my freedom. It is the reckoning you created. The years of suffering, the months of planning, and the careful execution of my strategy had led to this moment. I was free, strong, and unbroken. He had learned, in the hardest possible way, that a mother's strength cannot be imprisoned, that patience is a weapon more powerful than rage, and that betrayal, no matter how hidden, always comes to light. And so, with the weight of the past behind me and the promise of a future reclaimed, I stepped fully into my freedom. My son, forever changed, would carry the lessons of his choices for the rest of his life.